So today we are going to be talking about psychoanalytic and psychodynamic counseling and psychotherapy. And for those of you who are familiar with my textbooks, I have just spent the last 2 years re-recording all of my lectures for family therapy books. And now I am re-recording all the videos for my counseling textbooks, which definitely that textbook we're going to get updated soon, but I'm updating the videos before the textbook. So this is traditional psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy approaches. And I don't know about you, but I think they're like the most intimidating, the scariest, the most confusing and difficult to understand. Well, I don't know. Systemic strategic therapies are pretty tough too. Okay, we'll put those two in the toughest ones. I know there are folks here who are doing licensing exams. The good news for those of you who are trying to learn these theories to pass your licensing exam is, ironically, they're like some of the easiest to study for. So we'll get to that. But there's a lot here, and we're going to try to untangle it. And and I'll talk about it, there are a lot of different schools of psychodynamic. It's obviously the oldest. And so we're going to try to untangle some of those while looking at the commonalities, because they're still considered psychodynamic. There are some threads that run through it. Excellent. So what we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. So, like I said, this lecture designed to cover to accompany my textbooks. Oh no, I have the wrong cover up here. But I have Theory and Treatment Planning and Counseling and Psychotherapy, which is the main textbook this is supposed to go with, and the wrong book is up there. I'll have to fix that. And then a case documentation. And then I have two therapy, MFT theory books. There is a psychodynamic couple and family therapy lecture you will find on my YouTube channel. This is the traditional, I guess, individually focused psychodynamic psychoanalytic lecture. So you will find both, though, on my YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know already, if you go to therapythatworksinstitute.com/books, my book page there, you can use a QR code here. I have case conceptualization documents, treatment plans, all sorts of free clinical resources on my book page. You're going to need to put your name, you put your email, and you also put whether you're a student or a professor, because I will let you know as new resources become available. And you can get all of that for free on this website. If you're studying for licensing exams, you will find some really useful, all of these worksheets and case conceptualizations are really useful. And for those of you who are attending live today, if you would like what's called a letter of attendance during the last 5 minutes, I will put the link in the chat, and many graduate schools will count this as professional training. But you do have to attend live, and you can sign up for future ones if you're interested at the therapythatworksinstitute.com/YouTube live. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, lay of the land, what do we got here? So like I said, there are many different schools that are considered psychodynamic, and we're going to just look at some of the major ones today. So the classic one, obviously, we got Freud with psychoanalysis, and we've heard of drive theory. We'll go into that. Let's see. Next, we have ego psychology was kind of next, and it's very similar to drive theory or psychoanalysis and drive theory. It does use drive theory, but it also focuses a lot on the psychological defense mechanisms like projection. We'll go into that, but you've probably heard of that. So next up is object relations, and this really was a huge shift in the development of psychodynamic ideas, because both psychoanalysis and ego psychology is really what they call kind of focus on one person psychology, where they're focusing entirely on the client and the therapist, the neutral blank slate. So it's the laying on the couch stereotype with psychoanalysis and ego. Object relations is really where it moved into a two-person kind of relationship, and we'll talk more about that. But this is where we get the concept of secure attachment from. So that's object relations, and it really shifted what psychodynamic looks like from the drive theories and ego psychology. Then you have interpersonal analysis, which is actually focused, it's the only one that really focuses on behaviors, the behavioral interactions. And I noticed there's some MFTs on this live recording. And so this is really, Harry Stack Sullivan is the foundations of marriage and family therapy, really comes from interpersonal analysis. Then there is self-psychology, where they talk about self-objects, Kohut's work. And then most recently, there is actually intersubjectivity theory and relational theory that are very postmodern. And so they use postmodern concepts of two subjects relating. So we have this whole broad spectrum of what is called psychodynamic, from this kind of Freudian drive theory all the way to something that's incorporating societal dynamics and much more postmodern in its kind of conceptualization. So there is a lot here. So when someone says they're psychodynamic, you really don't know until they tell you which of these schools they're aligned with. Um, and there are other schools. These are not the only ones. These are the major ones. Oh, actually, there's one more here, the brief psychodynamic therapies, which is when we talk about evidence base for psychodynamic. There are some EBTs that are focused on like depression and such that are briefer. And again, it's a different variation. So when someone says they're psychodynamic, you just don't know. You got to ask. And it's important to kind of understand these distinctions. I remember I used to always assume that everyone was kind of object relations. And I was so surprised when I discovered that there were actually postmodern versions of psychodynamic theory. And so there are a lot of different schools, a lot of variety, and a lot of ways of practicing psychodynamic. But there are clearly some threads, and we'll be talking threads that connect them all that we'll be talking about today. So in the grand scheme of things, if you're familiar with my unifying framework, there are 4 different levels theories can operate on: behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and societal. And when you look at psychodynamic, these yellow boxes is kind of what you're going to see, what they really put out and how they conceptualize and work with clients. So you'll hear a lot about promoting insight, which is a very cognitive process. We'll be talking a lot about secure attachment, which is that's this attachment-based emotions is what they talk about, less about the reactive emotions, secondary emotions. And they do talk about complementary patterns, which in my unifying framework kind of goes with the behavioral, but looking at these opposites, these polarizations, these tensions, very much part of how they conceptualize. Okay. So the least you need to know about psychodynamic. So psychoanalytic and psychodynamic, get to this distinction in a moment. They analyze or conceptualize personality structures and functioning. So they're looking at how the psyche, the personality is structured, how it functions, and they work to make it less pathological, I guess, to use their language. And they really do this by trying to help clients develop insight into their own personality dynamics. So they're analyzing the structure of the personality, and we'll talk about the ways they conceptualize that. And then they try to help the client get insight into it to change their behavior. And it's called working through these insights toward action. So basically what's happening is the clinician's analyzing the dynamics, this personality, structure and dynamics of the client. They're helping the client gain insight into why they do, why they feel what they feel. And then they have them work through this, and we'll talk about what that means, but taking that insight and translating it into new ways, usually of relating to other people, interpreting other people, so that there's less reactivity. And there are many approaches they can vary significantly in what they look and feel like, both for the clinician and the client. So let's look at the juice. So for those of you who are new to my textbooks and such, the juice, the concept of this is when you look at all these theories, and I review about 50 or so in my textbooks, like each one gives us wisdom, right? Something that all of us can use, whether or not you identify as a psychodynamic therapist. What are some things from this approach that every clinician can really use, because they're such gems of wisdom And so I call this the juice, or these are the significant contributions to the field. And I highlight these so that I know some, you're going to go through, and usually your university or maybe your supervisor is saying you need to pick a theory and stick with it, right? But I want you to also just keep in mind the juice from all the different theories are really worth kind of putting into your toolbox to be reflecting on as a mental health professional, because these are just so important. So the first you've probably heard is transference and countertransference. And so I think no matter what theory you end up in, at some point in your graduate career, I certainly hope you were trained in the concepts of transference and countertransference. So let's talk about this to make sure you're kind of clear what it means. So transference, it comes from psychodynamic, psychoanalytic literature, and that is where the client is projecting onto the therapist some sort of attribute stemming from unresolved issues with a primary caregiver. The most common form of this is feeling like you project onto the therapist, the client projects onto the therapist, your critical parent. That's what most of us like to project onto authority figures. And so you perceive criticism when it is not there. And I will tell you, when I first got into, I was a professor for 27 years in the field of counseling and family therapy. I remember in the beginning, I had some psychodynamic colleagues say, yes, students just project all their unresolved parental issues onto us. I'm like, I don't know. But over the years, I began to realize, it is something that a lot of people do when you have an authority figure, whether it's, a therapist, a counselor, or a professor. If you haven't worked through those issues, it's very easy to hear a lot of criticism. I remember when I was directing the program, I just have these students come in and it's like, I'm so scared to tell Professor so-and-so, ask him these questions. And I'd be like, based on what? I mean, I've known Professor, X for 20 years, and this is the most approachable, empathetic, kind, understanding. And it would be like, what makes you think that so-and-so, this professor would be attacking you, and they're, I don't know, it just made me get anxious. So, you will definitely see that a lot in our field, and clients will do that to you. You've probably been doing it to your professors unless you've gone through a lot of therapy. And so realizing this is something that humans do. We fill in the blanks, we make assumptions. And so it's just something to be aware of. And when your clients respond to you in a way where you're like, wow, how did you get that out of this interaction? This is where you pause with empathy and to talk through what they're experiencing. And have what they call a corrective emotional experience. However, there is also countertransference. So countertransference is when we, the professional, are projecting onto our clients our narratives, our values. And we lose therapeutic neutrality. Now, oftentimes this is where I've seen this actually trip people up the most is with clients who are similar to them. So it's interesting. Most therapists are pretty open-minded and liberal thinking, and so we're pretty open to other ways of people being. But when you have a client who looks like you, so same social economic class, ethnic racial background, same gender identity, sexual identity, they're similar to you. It's interesting. You're actually more likely to project onto them what's normal, what should be expected. So countertransference has a lot of different forms, but if you have a client who's very angry, right, and maybe gets angry in a way that one of your parents did, or that could get you as a therapist to respond in ways where you lose your neutrality in terms of perceiving them and also not having the most therapeutic response. So this is why in psychodynamic therapy, it is critical, it is required. If you're appropriately trained, you will be doing multiple years of psychoanalysis to prevent you or to reduce the amount that you do countertransference and to really increase your awareness of this. And so it really is important, if you're going to try to use these ideas, that you do go through your own personal psychotherapy, because the one thing, with rare exception with these theories, I think a little bit, they talk about it most in the postmodern version of how the therapist is affecting the client. If you're not really aware and haven't worked through your reactivity and kind of your issues, so to speak, you can, because there's no check on your interpretation of the client behavior. There's no checks and balances. And so if you don't do this, you can unintentionally, do more harm than good. And so with transference and what you're using so when you experience transference, you're not upset at your client, disappointed, angry, or anything. You're like, great, this is a moment for a corrective emotional experience, is the term that they like to use. And this is where the client may project onto you, criticizing them for something maybe they just said, or being disappointed in them for something they just said. And instead, the corrective emotional experience is that you're accepting, right? You're understanding, you're empathetic. And so that's what they talk about, this corrective emotional experience, that you're going to respond differently to whatever, than whatever happened, the critical parent, let's say, as most people had one, and to resolve some of their inner conflicts and to learn how to, what they experienced in childhood and some of those negative experiences, is not the template for every relationship moving forward. And it creates this flexibility and responsiveness in clients. Okay, so let's look at the big picture and overview of the therapeutic process. So again, this is, for those of you taking your licensing exams, this is the gold that gets you through your psychodynamic questions. So the basic process, the basic flow of therapy is that there is listening and empathy. Empathy isn't necessarily done in a Rogerian way, that not all of them are going to be warm. Not all of them will validate. Some of them won't validate at all. That's not necessarily, but empathy means understanding and expressing that you understand how the client is feeling. It can be I would say most schools will use a more cognitive version, like I can understand how that was upsetting in a way that's not super warm necessarily, in a way that would be more of a humanistic school, although some schools do. We'll talk about that. But you're listening objectively and at least expressing understanding. And then by listening, expressing understanding, you're going to be offering interpretations of that behavior. And these interpretations are kind of where each school is a little bit different, how they end up at the interpretation. But there's going to be an interpretation that leads to insight about why you feel what you feel, why you do what you do, why you experience relationships the way you experience. And so these insights are into your own personal and interpersonal dynamics. So understanding why you kind of crumple, when you perceive that maybe your partner or your boss or your professor might be criticizing or, not liking what you just did. And let's say you kind of cave in and crash, or you get angry and belligerent, whatever you do, the therapist is going to help you identify that and go back to why you might be doing that based on your early childhood experiences. And then finally, we have this phrase, working through, which is getting in touch with, the repressed strivings and the defense response to make the unconscious conscious. And then once the unconscious is conscious, then helping you translate that into action to transform your daily emotional experiences and your interpersonal interactions. So this is one of the constants across all the different approaches: listening, empathy. And empathy, just remember, it's psychodynamic empathy can look very different than humanistic forms of empathy, but in, promoting insight and then working through the emotions to put them into action. And so here is a nice little diagram just to like visualize. So first, you're assessing these personality dynamics and unconscious processes. So all of them do it in different ways. That assessment process is very different, but how they do it is similar. Then you're facilitating insight in one way or another. You're helping them work through this insight, which means becoming more and more aware of it, more conscious of it, what you're doing now, how it's related to the past, and working through those emotions, processing those emotions, and hopefully getting to a new sets of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors through this psychodynamic process. So, I told you, I'd promise you I'd give you the distinction between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic. Psychoanalysis is distinct. I mean, is definitely associated with Freud, but it is just a much more intense approach, really designed to create significant and sustainable personality change. So this is like long-term, intensive, typically 2 to 5 times a week for several years, okay? But this is not just focused on some, depression, getting through depression or anxiety. Psychoanalysis is about restructuring your whole personality, not just treating symptoms. So that's the main difference between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy, is that in psychoanalysis, it is a long-term restructuring of your personality to address, all of the kind of personality and interpersonal dynamics that you may have gotten from childhood, to make you aware of these and to really shift your whole personality structure through that process. And this is what is required that you do to be considered a psychodynamic therapy when you're formally trained in psychodynamic, which this is one approach where I strongly recommend that you do seek out formal training. That should take several years. This is not something you do casually from a textbook or read a couple books and say that you call yourself psychodynamic. You do need years of training, and you need years of your own psychotherapy, your own psychoanalysis specifically, in order to do this work and be not only effective, but to not do harm, because you can do a lot of harm if you aren't aware of your own dynamics and your own patterns, and you have a lot of unconscious stuff that's not worked through. You're going to be doing a lot of countertransference, and you will be doing harm to your clients. The psychodynamic is you are targeting specific symptoms or problems. Okay. So this is what most people do when they do psychodynamic. They're targeting specific symptoms or problems. I guess I should mention that, at least in the United States, psychoanalysis is not in that form 2 to 5 times a week, for 2 or 3 years, is generally not covered that well by insurance. I do know that in Europe, there are countries that truly pay for psychoanalysis at that level, but that's not typical here in the United States. Psychodynamic, on the other hand, is what we would think of as you're targeting depression or anxiety or OCD, those sorts of things. Sessions are typically once per week for several months to a couple of years. Okay, so it still can be long term, but it's more like once a week. You have a goal that's related to a DSM diagnosis. A psychoanalysis can definitely be used for personality disorders. Would be what indicated for personality disorders, but psychodynamic you can use for more typical things in the DSM. So that's the difference. Okay, so let's look at the therapeutic relationship. And again, the therapeutic relationship, this is one thing that is very different across the different schools. Remember, we have almost now 150 years of history, something long. We're getting up there. We're getting well over, yeah, we're getting up to 150 years of history of psychoanalysis. And so there are many different schools, and there's dramatic differences, 9-day differences in some cases, of what the therapeutic relationship looks like. So it's real important that this, along with case conceptualization, are the two big distinguishing factors across the various schools of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy. So the first distinction is the one-person relationship versus two-person relationships. So as I mentioned on that first screen, Lay of the Land, we talked about it, that it's only Freudian and ego psychology that's a one-person relationship, meaning we are just conceptualizing the client, and the therapist is not considered like having a therapeutic relationship. They're a neutral blank slate, and the client, so the client can project onto them. So they try to be super neutral, and the client's projecting onto them is how they're conceptualizing it, versus two-person relationships. So starting with object relationships and everything that came after that, they are conceptualizing it as a two-person back and forth relationship in the more traditional way that most other schools of psychotherapy consider the therapeutic relationship. So we have this idea of transference, which we definitely see in the one-person relationship situations, but we do see this in the other schools, where part of the therapeutic relationship is that we end up neutral, and that includes even our work environment. You try to have your office be somewhat neutral, your dress to be neutral, that allows a client to project onto you their patterns so you can see them more clearly. So there is this neutrality, and how blank slate, and some people have very little emotion, blank slate. But there is varying degrees in any case of the transference And rather than run and scream and be horrified by it, you're like, okay, great. I'm glad this came up. We can work through this. It's kind of the psychodynamic attitude. I'm glad you're pissed at me. We're going to like talk through this. And so that is how they use transference. And then object relations gives us this concept of what you've probably heard of the holding environment. And the holding environment concept comes from how a good enough mother parents in terms of having a secure, most of the time you're able to meet the needs of your child. Most of the times as a therapist, you're able to meet the emotional needs of your client. There are temporary, minor failures where you kind of you miss the ball, right? But there's this holding environment that is nurturing, that's empathetic, that is understanding. It still holds people accountable, but there's a warmth there that you didn't get in earlier schools. And that's called the holding environment, that to really ensure that the therapeutic space is safe. It's often called a safe container. And this holding environment that's going to be this safe place for them to, process what's going on in their life. And it doesn't mean that they're not challenged, but there is this emotional safety, secure attachment. And so there is this concept of empathy, and there's varying degrees of warmth across the various schools. But it's this concept of rather than doing the blank slate, right? The old kind of traditional, more Freudian ego psychology where there's not a lot of warmth. This is saying that, it's okay for the therapist to have some of that warmth, to create the relationship, to create the emotional safety in the relationship. Then we have mirroring. This comes from self-psychology, from Kohut, but it's in the therapeutic relationship. You are confirming the client's sense of self. So there is this reflecting back the client's sense of who they are, and so you become a mirror so that they can see who they are, to see their sense of self, but it's very confirming. May not always use the term validating for that, but confirming of the sense of self. And then in the more postmodern constructionist approaches to psychodynamic, there's this what they call intersubjectivity. And this is where they're realizing that the therapist, this is two subjects, right? Two subjective realities, the therapist subject, this being an agent in their world. We're going back to some old school language here. And the client being a subject, meaning they're an agent in their life, that they are creating meaning, they're relating together, and that the therapist and who they are, the client is not truly, a therapist is never really a blank slate from this perspective. We come in, you cannot be blank. We can't be truly neutral, being, just being, female or male or, older or younger or whatever it is, right? That you're not blank. You're never going to be blank. So, and that we have to account for this. Social location is a term that I think we would generally use in the field to describe that, and that we are relating as two people, and who the therapist is, how they talk, how they present shapes the client's behavior. So this is, if you're familiar with social constructionism from the postmodern therapies, it very much is the same concept. It's postmodern. So we are two people constructing realities together, and the therapist behavior is there's no way to not have it shape the client's experience and their behaviors in therapy. And again, as I said earlier, that a key to the therapeutic relationship is you going through your own personal psychoanalysis for several years to really get clear and working through your stuff, clear on your interrelational patterns, so that you don't subconsciously, unconsciously enact those patterns, in session. If you're getting angry at your clients, you're frustrated, if you're feeling judged by your clients, that's something from this perspective, like you need to go and work on that and figure out what you got going on, so that you're less reactive, because you should be able to be pretty emotionally attuned and neutral still with your clients. The emotionally attuned is more what psychodynamic looks like in the 21st century. That's why I say that. This is an academic lecture, so I'm trying to cover the history but in contemporary practice, most people have a certain degree of warmth that can vary. But the therapist should never be reacting to what the client is doing, no matter what it is. Even if the client is, clients can be hostile or judgmental or questioning. You should be able to maintain that sense of neutrality. And if not, there's stuff for you to look at. I will leave it there. I'll let you figure it out from there. So let's go into the viewing and case conceptualization. And similar to the therapeutic relationship, this is where we are going to see huge variation in terms of how the different schools do this. And so both the therapeutic relationship and the case conceptualization are the two main things that are different and distinguish the various schools. So starting with Freud, levels of consciousness. It's one of the earliest concepts in the field, and it still endures. We have the conscious mind, which includes sensations and experiences that the person is aware of. You have the pre-conscious mind. So this is kind of the memories and experiences that you can kind of retrieve with relative ease, like with your childhood, right? Things like that, things that you're semi-aware of. And then you have the unconscious mind, which holds the memories, thoughts, and desires that the conscious mind cannot tolerate, and is the source of the innate drives that are talked about in this theory. So that's where the unconscious mind, kind of where you stuff parts of yourself that you don't want to acknowledge. And I think arguably too, just when you were younger and don't quite recall or weren't able to process. I might be adding a little bit of neurological science there. All right. So the structures of the self. So you've probably heard of the id, ego, and superego. And so the first part, so there's three structures. In German, because Freud wrote about this in German, it was called the das Es, which is the it, which always sounds, I think, a little more gentle. I speak German, so it's a little much more gentle. The it always has got a connotation of kind of being this, I don't know, kind of darker force than I think it needs to be. It doesn't need to be. I think we've given it a lot of dark connotations or negative connotations in the English language, but in the original Freud's use of the term, it has a much more neutral sound. It's it, like it is, right? That it, S is it. But it's the unorganized part of the personality that is motivated by instinctual drive. So it's the part of you that just wants to eat a whole box of cookies and binge watch Netflix and whatever it might be. Um, so so this is the it, the S, the id. The id is a Latin version of it. But that this is this kind of unregulated, kind of chaotic, impulsive, um, usually not socially, and much of what comes out of the id is not like the socially approved impulses. The ego in German is das Ich. It's the I. It's I, like I, Diane. I is the ego, which is part of the conscious mind. And again, in the English language, ego has a lot of negative, connotations because of egotistic. You're egotistical, definitely a negative word. Where this is just the I. This is like your identity. It has a more neutral term in more neutral connotations in German. But it's the part of the personality that has the intellect, the cognition. It's where your defense mechanisms are located and other executive functions. But it's the kind of the conscious mind, the I. It's the part of the ego structure that when we talk about me, myself, and I, it's this part of you. It's what you identify with, and it's your conscious mind, and it's also just the part of your personality that you you own, and you're aware of, and how you define yourself, quite frankly, because most of us wouldn't say the id, or is part necessarily of our personality, but Freud conceptualized these as part of the structures of the personality. Now this ego is also the mediator, though, between the id and what we're going to call the superego. It's kind of the mediator that kind of works between the two impulses, and so it's kind of the middle ground, kind of the reasonable part of the personality structure. And then we have the superego, which I love in the German translation, it's not the translation. In the German original of the term, it's the Über-Ich, which is the above me or the over me. So there's the self, my identity, the I, and then there's the above me, which is a society, right? And So it's social ideals, right? And it's what you should be doing. So the Uber Ich, then you have the Ich, and then you have the S, which is the id. And so the Uber Ich is kind of making sure that you follow the social rules, that you don't get kicked out of the tribe, right? So its job primarily ends up being prohibiting what the id wants to do, right? And it's funny when you think of those of you who are familiar with internal family systems, there's a bit of this same, three parts kind of negotiating, with the manager kind of being more like the id. And but the Uber Ich is the one that has all the societal rules. It's trying to get you to behave, basically, and to become socially acceptable. So these are the three structures of the personality that Freud conceptualized. They are still widely used today. And it's these structures that you're trying to get to work more effectively together in long-term psychoanalysis. You have drive theory, which comes from Freud and early psychoanalysis. We're looking at these, what they believe are instinctual drives. They come hardware, right? Hardwired into humanity. And in terms of our programming, there is the libido, which is sexual energy, and then the death drive. And there are some other drives and different approaches. We'll stick with these for here, but we have the libido, that is sexual energy, and the death drive, which is the source of aggressive energy. We do have the Freudian stages of psychosexual development. You have the oral stage, which is about dependency and security. See, you have the anal stage, which is about control. The phallic stage, morality and superego. And then you have latency and the genital stage. So I give this to you because it's part of psychodynamic theory. And I think the people I've talked to who practice, using psychodynamic in contemporary context, this is more metaphorical. We could do a whole long workshop on this. But kind of looking at some of these themes and patterns when you're analyzing people's personality structures. So another concept that I think is widely used across all of the schools is seeing symptoms that are presented, so depression, anxiety, OCD, psychosis, that they represent interpsychic conflict. And this conflict is often between, right, your id, your ego, and your superego, right? So emotions that can't otherwise be consciously acknowledged or expressed. So this is how they see symptoms as and what the purpose of symptoms are. They talk about primary gains, which is the primary benefit of the symptom. So let's say you are, you're depressed, right? And so the primary gain might be that you get out of social circumstances, you get your partner to do more around the house, whatever it might be. Whereas secondary gains are benefits that may not be immediately related, but are a natural consequence nonetheless. So for example, I've just certainly seen folks who kind of stay stuck in their symptoms because they like, it would be like getting the validation and the sympathy of being a victim in some way, or having this untreatable condition, or with trauma, it can happen where they get this attention that they like. And so it's a secondary gain of having the symptom, whether or not it's conscious. And so this is how, certainly is the psychodynamic analysis, and you can argue with it. And, and this is where you really have to listen and observe clients to understand this. From the outside, you can't immediately, I think, determine that, but it is something that they will look for and analyze. And so defense mechanisms are fun. And again, this could certainly qualify for juice in terms of these concepts. I think are very useful no matter what school of theoretical approach that you use. But these are kind of like automatic responses to perceived psychological threats. There are a whole bunch of them. Of course, we have denial. It's not just a river in Egypt, but this is where you deny a problem, you don't see it. I do a lot of couple family work, and boy, that is common there. Introjection is just kind of taking in someone's ideas or beliefs, usually a parent's, swallowing it whole and kind of taking on these beliefs without really processing or reflecting. A very common one are the gender roles that you may have gotten as a child, or your client may have gotten as a child, and these really aren't reflected. Splitting is huge. This is something I think I do. I guess I do a lot of couple family therapy. So we see a lot of splitting. Splitting is very characteristic of borderline personality, but that is seeing things in terms of all good or all bad. So seeing a person as all good, all bad. So borderline personality, there's a lot of, you put someone up on a pedestal, they do one thing to upset you, and then they're the devil, and then you can flip-flop back and forth regularly between that. But just even when you hear any client talking about anything, or anyone in their life is all good or all bad, it should give you, it's reason to pause, because no one's all good or all bad. It's all there. You want there to be a spectrum of how they see situations, how they see people, because that's going to create a lot more, that ability to see the complexity of things, to see both the good and the bad in the same person or the same situation, leads to psychological health. And so much of these approaches are about helping people reduce splitting of how they see themselves, how they see others. Even like narcissism, I'm either totally amazing, the best person in the room, or I'm a total loser, right? It's just black and white. There's no middle ground. It's like, I'm good at some things and not so great at others, and that's okay. So that's what you're trying to resolve, some of that splitting. Projection, we talked about it. Projective identification is when you project onto someone else, usually your unconscious thoughts, desires, or wishes, and often then attack them for it. So repression is more of the unconscious process of stuffing some kind of thought or impulse that you don't want to acknowledge or be identified with. And then suppression is when you consciously push something out of your mind. So for example, I have a few clients right now who are very good at suppressing. They can see the huge issues in their marriage, but they just go back and suppress them and pretend like nothing's going on. So, you can see these different dynamics in people and in your clients. Okay, this next one is Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. And so this is also widely used. It is used both by psychodynamic therapists, and I think psychologists and psychotherapists generally. Obviously, I'm sure all of you listening have heard of this, so we'll go quickly through it. But this is used to just conceptualize where your client might be stuck. So the infant stage is trust versus mistrust. So it's an infant learning how to trust. And obviously, if you didn't get that, the therapist needs to go back and start at stage 1 and teach you how to be vulnerable and have trust again. Then there's autonomy versus shame and doubt, the toddler stage, where you're learning to be autonomous, have agency, and learning how to manage then your shame and doubt. And so hopefully you learn how to take action, be an agent without kind of getting stuck in shame and doubt when you fail, when it doesn't work out, because we all know that's part of the process. Initiative versus guilt. So this is preschool and kindergarten age, where you're learning to take initiative to do things versus the guilt of making mistakes. Industry versus inferiority. And we'll pick up with inferiority with Adler, but we see it here. This is where you're learning to, putting an effort to strive and obviously fail many times before you succeed, versus, do you handle failure in a way where you just feel inferior and you don't get up and try again. And so that's hopefully something we should be learning in school-age children. In adolescence, the developmental task is to develop a sense of identity versus identity confusion, who you are, who you're not. That's where you have all the friends and you're developing and then separating from your parents. And intimacy versus isolation in young adulthood. Can you form close, intimate relationships versus do you get stuck in isolation? Adulthood is generativity versus stagnation. Can you create? Can you do? Can you make things happen, right? Versus do you stagnate? Do you linger? Do you get stuck in kind of a lifeless, passionless life? And then integrity versus despair for the later years. Now, there have been tons of critiques. Feminists were first first on board to critique this. So there's a whole actually school of feminist psychotherapy that reimagines these stages for women. But nonetheless, there are themes here that will be used in psychodynamic therapy to help analyze what's going on with their clients. And there are, feminist versions. I have a feminist lecture, so I'll go over those in that lecture. But I think this is a useful for understanding, one of the ways that psychodynamic therapists will actually conceptualize what's going on with their clients and where they might be stuck. And so you'd go back if they're stuck in shame or self-doubt or guilt or inferiority, not knowing who they are, they'll go back and kind of look at what's going on approximately in these various stages. So object relations theory. So in this approach, objects refer to a person, most often one's mother or primary caregiver. But these objects can be kind of internalized representations or the actual person. So it can be a representation of your mother in your inner imagined world. There are also objects in the external world. And the main concept here is having this good enough mothering. Don't have to have perfect parenting, but when you have good enough mothers, you're able to really respond to their clients' communication and needs, that the child is able to develop what they call the true self. And so this is being able to express your needs in appropriate ways and get your needs met. If the caretaker is either too cold or too chaotic, what happens is you develop what's called the false self, which is overly anxious, trying to comply to the needs of others in order to get your needs met. So this good enough mothering is certainly not about being perfect. In fact, a little bit of not being perfect is a good thing. But there needs to be enough of this validating, safe, emotional presence, whether it's a mother or another caregiver, that that you can develop this true self. And it's because they create that sense of secure attachment, so that the child knows that most of the time when you reach out to your nurturing caregiver, you're going to get the support you need. It's never going to be perfect. And it's part of growing up, learning that someone can love you and not be 100% there for you. Excuse me, I'm having trouble here with my voice. It's part of growing up. But so a secure attachment is having enough of that validation that you have a sense of self that is clear. You know what your needs are and how to ask for them appropriately and get them met, and vice versa in relationships, being able to respond to the needs of others. Okay, narcissism and the self object. So this is self-psychology, Kohut self-psychology. So Kohut worked with a lot of narcissists to develop the self-psychology around that population. And he talked about narcissistic objects, narcissistic object relations, and viewing all the objects as if they were parts of the self, or at least performing a crucial function of the self. And he says that we kind of develop these based on, our idealized parent, the perfect parent in our childhood imagination, and also this grandiose sense of self. So as a child, and I think I've seen this, in kids, you can see it. There's this grandiose, heroic, they all want to be superheroes type of self, right? Or perfect in some way, and seeing the parent that way. And if you have effective parenting, what they call parental empathy, it creates a cohesive sense of self, and you're able to accept where you're not as grand as you imagined, maybe as a preschooler, when you felt like you were Superman or Superwoman. You're able to develop a cohesive sense of self, a more realistic evaluation of yourself through parental empathy. But if there was deprivation where the parents weren't able to do mirroring, is what it's called, mirroring back your value as a person, or if there's trauma, what happens is these idealizing grandiose objects kind of continue on in a very unaltered state. So in that sense, you see yourself as all powerful, or, and all perfect and amazing and better than everyone else, or worse than everyone else. It is not integrated. It is this either or. So if you watch narcissists, when they're getting their ego needs met, they're fine. They're great. Their psychology is good. But as soon as the world doesn't reflect back their worth, you either get wrath, or they can slide into a pretty serious depression, but everything falls apart. So what Cohen is saying is because they didn't develop a coherent sense of self through parental empathy, you end up with this polarity in their personality structure. Okay. The relational matrix, and so this is intersubjective theory. So this is the postmodern version, right? They talk about this relational matrix is how they're understanding their clients, and that we all have this kind of relational matrix that we use to organize and frame and interpret the clinical information. But the mind, the individual mind cannot be understood out of this context. And so the individual mind includes both self, other objects and transactional patterns. And it includes these contextual, societal, social norms. And so the basic unit of analysis is never just the individual, as it is in most every other form of therapy, but it's the self and context. So you're like, what is this person's psychology like in a given context, and that you can have different selves based on different contexts. Very postmodern, straight Ken Gergen right there, if you're familiar with social constructionist therapy. Along with this, the second part of this is looking at these unconscious organizing principles that come to us through our families and through culture, so that we have this as part of our unconscious. We have this templating from society and family about how we interpret the experiences, the relationships, things that happen in our life. And you cannot not have these templates. We all have them to organize and to make sense and interpret the world. And so the therapist tries to identify these unconscious organizing principles, explore them, and see if they need some revision to really kind of match what's going on and to be more accurate. Okay. I'm aware that I've been going for an hour. And so those of you who need to get your certificate, because you maybe have a client at one, why am I not able to paste here? I'm gonna go ahead and put the link for the letter in the chat box in case anyone needs that. And then I will continue and take questions at the end. Okay, so keep moving forward here. We're going to look at targeting and goal setting. So what are the goals? What are the goals of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy look like? So obviously addressing irrational impulses that may be around substances or sex or anger management, right? Stress management and defenses are things they will focus on. Creating ego strength so you can tolerate tension and conflict with others in healthy ways, building self-esteem and self-cohesion, developing insight followed by agency and action, developing emotional maturity and emotional intelligence, reducing perfectionism, and restructuring personality, especially in psychoanalysis. So these are some of the typical goals of these theories, along with mature dependency and intimacy. So learning how to have emotionally secure relationships is critical, both with romantic partners as well as with children, of course. Okay. So let's look at some of the interventions, and this is where on the licensing exam it gets easy because there's not like a whole lot here, and they're very distinct. So you'll find that's why I say these are some of the easiest questions on the licensing exams. So working through, that's your key word there, interpretation and working through. So it's based on your case conceptualization. We just went through a whole bunch of different ways to do that. You kind of wait for the moment as the client is talking. You wait for the correct moment to just offer that interpretation. Just jumping in and blurting it out the second you can see it. We're usually way ahead of our clients. And so you wait for the right moment to put out an interpretation, especially one that might be more challenging in terms of something like, do you think maybe the reaction to your boss has anything to do with having how your critical parent would talk to you, these sorts of things. And you tend to work from the present to the past. So you would start with what might be going on, with their boss in the present moment, and then working back to childhood. And you're always assessing your client's response. And so One of the things, I believe it was Kohut who said this, if you don't see behavioral change from your interpretations, like the clients aren't taking your interpretations, understanding, agreeing with them, working through them, and changing their behavior, you might just be wrong. So you really do want to look at what the client's response is and whether it's really facilitating change. So empathy, there is what they call an understanding, explaining sequence. And empathy can typically looks a bit different in psychodynamic than it does in humanistic, where I would say in psychodynamic, you will tend to have a more cognitive expression of empathy, where in humanistic, they are talking about being congruent. It's a much more present, felt emotion. That said, there is a spectrum here. So you have the understanding phrase, which is an expression of empathy, which is something along the lines of I can understand in this case how my being late must have been upsetting, or I can understand how your dad not showing up to all your soccer games must have left you feeling, unloved and unappreciated by him. So it's a more cognitive. There can be some warmth in there, but it is still a more cognitive expression of empathy typically. And then you have the explanation phrase. So you always make sure you give them some empathy. You can understand how you felt that way. And then the explanation is providing some form of interpretation to promote insight, to understand their emotions. So, we all care about how those around us see us and treat us. So this would explain maybe why they got so upset because the therapist was running late. So you're going to be, it's the explanation phrases where you introduced the interpretation to promote insight, okay? So empathy followed by interpretation. You don't ever just jump in straight to interpretation. You try to have some of that empathy to balance things out, at least in object relations in later phase. So yeah, and you do need to look for evidence that your interpretation is correct, the client's agreeing with you, they're able to take that and translate it into meaningful action, because that's where we have to, there isn't a built-in corrective mechanism per se, where some other schools of psychotherapy I think have this, but this you do need to look for evidence in the outside world that your interpretation is correct, rather than kind of beating your client over the head like I have the truth and you do not. Don't recommend that approach. Okay, so let's look at other common interventions. One is free association. This is, classic Freudian, giving words and having clients do free association with that. You see that in projective tests as well are based on this kind of concept here. Dream interpretation, can be very huge, looking at these as dreams is representing various objects typically in the dream. Intersubjective responding, it comes out of the intersubjectivity theory, the more postmodern version of this, where you're looking at the considerations of age, gender, race, social class, in terms of including these into your interpretations and also to your relations with the clients. Okay, research and the evidence base. So most of the research is around evidence-based versions of these, which are, again, very manualized treatments, brief psychodynamic therapy and counseling that are like designed to treat something like psychodynamic or depression or something specific. And there is there are some, so interpersonal psychotherapy is an EBT based on psychodynamic, and there's another one called core conflictual relationship theme models, but these are some of the leading evidence-based treatments that are based on psychodynamic for specific populations. There is less, I think, robust research on, psychoanalysis and some of those, but there are some EBTs that are based on psychodynamic specifically. So there is definitely a research base for this. Looking at working with diverse populations, it certainly is probably the most criticized therapeutic approach around the lines of gender, LGBTQ, and the racial identity types of critiques. So all of this, if you're working with diverse clients, even if you're working with women, which is like 70% of who shows up for therapy, you really want to make sure that you're considering some of the potential issues of these approaches with diverse populations. In the classic form of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapies, many experts would say that this insight-oriented approach is not necessarily a good fit um, for many groups, and especially if they want a more practical hands-on, especially if you're relying on interpretations that aren't cultural or gender informed. There's a lot of places where this can go wrong, just to be aware of that. Um, Also, with a lot of cultural groups, especially immigrant groups, the concept of discussing your past to solve a present problem seems like a waste of time. So if you've got a super busy life, you're working multiple jobs, support your family, you you don't come from a culture that's very insight or focused on psychological concepts such as European and Western American type things. This is just weird, okay? And so they don't see the point. Why do I need to analyze my childhood when right now it's my marriage is a mess or my kids running away or whatever it might be? It doesn't connect it. They don't see the link because if they didn't grow up with the concept of our past, with the belief, it's really a belief that the past childhood stuff affects the present. But there clearly are lots of cases where psychodynamic can be successfully adapted to work with a wide and diverse population. It just, you need to be very careful about how you apply these concepts and making sure that they fit with your client's worldview. In particular, sexual diversity and gender, sexual identity, that there are many heteronormative assumptions in this theory, especially the earlier theories. You look at Freud's psychosocial, theory of development. So looking at it has been adopted to work with LGBTQ. It can work that way. There are ways that you can adapt it, but you want to go and research those and really be mindful of that sort of thing when working with diverse populations. And oftentimes, one of the things they talk about is this concept of ego building to help with diverse clients, which is naming feelings, alerting to potential difficult. So ego building is to help one of the strategies to help adapt psychodynamic. I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking here. To working with diverse populations is what they call ego building, which is either helping name the feelings and also just when you're alerting clients to potentially difficult interpretations. So you say, I'm going to share, are you okay if I share, a perspective that might help you understand what might be going on with you? So you're kind of asking permission, you're alerting them that this perspective might not sit right, and just, being able to name those things, talk about the process of what's going on in therapy to help work with diverse clients who may find talking about all this stuff from the past to resolve issues in the present is a very foreign concept. Okay. So final reflections here. Psychodynamic, psychoanalytic are really the first psychotherapy approaches, and hopefully, if nothing else today, you are clear that there are many, many different schools that are vastly different. There are significant variations across these schools. But they're all very insight oriented, and they're trying to take this insight to turn it into action. And that you definitely need to adapt these approaches when working with diverse clients, whether it be, female, LGBTQ, ethnically diverse clients, considering social class, education level, developmental, status, all these different and neurodiversity too, in terms of how this might work with someone who's on the autism spectrum or with ADHD. You need to really think about how you adapt this for certain populations, because straight out of the box, it's not going to necessarily work with everyone. And I think the last thing I also want to say is that you want to really get trained well in these approaches. These are not casual. There are other theories out there. There are many other theories out there that you can kind of read books, go to a 6-hour workshop, and sort of kind of do it. This is not one of those. This is one where you should be training for at least 2 years with constant supervision and your own personal psychoanalysis before you try to work this way. It's not something you kind of do casually. I just want to throw that out there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up for questions. I'm going to go ahead and actually one more time put in the chat if you're attending live. Here is the link to get your your certificate of attendance. But if you're attending live, you can see the Q&A. You can pop your questions in there. So what is your reaction to therapist tearing with or for the client? So Ari, I think you mean tearing up with the client. I come from a school where that level of transparency is, I think, a good thing. I don't know if every psychodynamic therapist would agree with me on that one. How about that? So that's a high level of transparency. It's something more you would see in a humanistic than you would in a typical psychodynamic. Okay. Oops, I see what you're saying about, uh-huh. You are correct about the wrong link being in the chat. Let's try this one again. My apologies. I have a lot of Zoom links in my life. You are correct. Thank you for correcting me. That is a letter of attendance in the chat. Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, Triva saying she teared up and my client got angry. That is fascinating. I'm sure there's a lot there. I don't know why that would be, but that's interesting, right? So why do they get angry? So, as a psychodynamic, therapist, you want to get curious about how they interpreted that. And that is, a difficult moment. You want to honor their experience, right? And apologize, if they misunderstood, but you want to get intensely curious as to why. You don't want to defend yourself, but you want to get curious. Okay. Maria is saying every time I watch one of these lectures, she wants to go get certified at that approach. I love it. Okay, I love the dodo bird idea. They have found that all interventions win a prize and that the real basis of change is the relationship and the common factors. Certainly the relationship is the biggest driver of change for absolute sure. Okay. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, folks. Yeah, so we got folks glossing Ken Gergen here. Ken Gergen. Okay, awesome. Is it a psychic structure that has a lot to do with splitting? Okay. Someone's saying the opposite of black and white thinking. What is object constancy is the opposite of black and white thinking. So object constancy is you're able to keep in mind that like your mother has both good and bad parts. Your mom can be nice. You can also be strict. And that's kind of, what do you call it again? Okay. Who was the first object relations therapist? Maybe a test question. Look that up. I do have it in my counseling theory textbook. I don't know if Melanie Klein wins that award, but I would have to look that up. Awesome. Oh, Diana is asking, how does psychodynamic inform contextual family therapy? So Bowen family therapy very much developed from Sullivan, and contextual family therapy, the work of Bojarmani-Naj, also it comes out of these psychodynamic schools. There are object relation versions of psychodynamic therapy for working with couples and families. So you're really focusing on those object relation patterns. But in contextual, you have this, ledger of entitlements and indebtedness. And I think that ledger is a very client-friendly way to describe a lot of your accounting system, right, is something you got templated from your family of origin, who owes what to whom. That very much comes from your family of origin and your early life experiences, including if you had neglect, if you had trauma, you could have a very skewed sense of who owes what to whom. Sometimes you think you're entitled to more. Sometimes you think you're entitled to too little. So it can go either way. What would be the ethical considerations when working with unconscious material that may involve repressed trauma? Whew, wow, there is not only ethical, there are legal considerations with repressed trauma. It's certainly something you want to not be driving the charge on that. I have had clients come to me where they tell me a therapist thinks that they were abused as a child, but they don't remember it, and you really want to be careful around saying something like that and assuming something like that. You can wonder it, you can be curious about it, and you can continue to know I should go back and assess for that. but I would be very, very cautious about assuming you see certain dynamics that it means that there is, some kind of repressed trauma. And so what I have found, if you're thinking a whole event, a trauma event has been repressed, just working with what's happening in the world today, work in the present, look what's going on, and then see if you can connect dots to make sense of why they respond to certain situations in certain ways. And keep looking for past events that might explain that with clients. And I wait for them. I mean, going and hypothesizing for them is, I think, legally even not just it's ethically problematic, but it's also legally problematic. And I would be very cautious to be making assumptions about quote unquote repressed trauma. Just you can almost always work on solving issues with a client in the present, whether or not you know all the details of the past trauma. And I'll tell you, I once worked with a foster child who I was quite certain. In fact, she told me there was some sort of sexual trauma. She had a whole bunch of acting out behaviors that looked just like, the result of sexual trauma. But she looked at me, she must have been 7 or 8, but she'd been in the system. And she just looked at me, she goes, I'm not going to answer that question about whether or not, she'd been, anyone touched her inappropriately. She goes, I'm not going to answer that question because I know what the law is, and I'm never going to answer that question. And so I worked with her. It took a while. It was 4 or 5 years. And she had sexual acting out behaviors on her foster siblings. But, over 4 or 5 years, I never knew what actually happened to her, but we were able to resolve the trauma. We got her connected up with a safe parent again and living back in the home, and all the sexual acting out started. She started behaving appropriately for her age. And so we worked through it. It wasn't, it was 4 or 5 years at least, right? It was a long term, but we were able to still do a lot of work. So getting obsessed over knowing the details of what happened is not always necessary. And you can do a ton of getting the present life and present relationships working beautifully without knowing the nitty-gritties. So don't get hung up on knowing about the event, is what I would say. Oh, the Oedipal stage? No, Fred, I don't. Fred's asking, do I give any credence to that? No, I think it's in the textbook. I just pulled it out. I'm a woman. I don't know. It's kind of weird. So no, I don't put a lot of, I'm not psychodynamic. And it could be that drive therapists, ego psychologists and traditional, so, there might be some clinicians out there who found a great way to use it. I didn't find it in the literature. It doesn't occur to me as I look at it as a practicing clinician, trained, in other school. I actually had a lot of psychodynamic training as well. Um, so no, I don't, to answer your question. So awesome, awesome. So, Jason, is there any place to watch how I utilize family and couples interventions and conceptualizations of psychodynamic theories that are listed on worksheet 1 of Laugh Your Way to Licensure? The only place, and I am so sorry, I've tried for over a decade. I recorded a whole series of videos for Cengage to go with my textbooks. They exist, but you have to buy the ebook versions. And I have tried with multiple editors to get a standalone cheap version of that so people can access it. But you have to pay. You have to rent a textbook to see it, which very much, infuriates me, to be honest. That would be the correct emotion I have. But I've not been able to get that as standalone. In fact, in my mind, I'm like, I just need to re-record all 16 videos myself, pay for the audience, try to figure out how to pay for a crew and just redo it all. So awesome. Erica is saying I do have some, oh yes. So if you don't know, if you didn't get the email, um, if you didn't get the email, there is a free workshop that coming up on what's called decision doors. I'm very excited about it. It is going, and there are some live simulations that are really an incredible deal. And so if you haven't signed up for this workshop, there are going to be 3 live events that you can attend. You do get your continuing education hours with the decision doors. If you're watching the recording, I'm sorry, this event is past. Join the mailing list and there'll be a new something cool and fun in the future. But this is where I help clients make really difficult decisions. It's really everyone's favorite intervention. They talk about it, months later. They're like, still thinking about those doors, Diane. So I'm finally, after many years, putting this into a standalone training. It used to be part of my Therapy That Works courses. So awesome. Okay. Let me see. So it sounds like hopefully I answered most of the questions. If there's any question that is unanswered, please put it in the, oh, I see some Q&A over here. Okay, great. Someone's agreeing with me. Awesome. Let's see. How do you how to handle who's afraid of disappointing their therapist? So this is a great question. Eva is asking, how do you handle a client who's afraid of disappointing their therapist? So one thing I do with all clients, until they start disagreeing with me, I assume they're people pleasing me to some extent and to some degree or another. They don't want to disappoint. They don't want to upset me, especially if they're a feeling type on the Myers-Briggs or a female or just kind of have a people pleasing personality. I assume that. So I always give them multiple choice options whenever we're talking about different things. So that they have to make a choice and they get the signal that no matter what you want is, no matter what your preference is for something, that's okay. In terms of people pleasing, I do a lot of self-deprecating humor. I do a lot of even sharing about imperfections and really reducing the pressure to be perfect all the time. So I tell stories to help normalize imperfection. I do stories about how, how to weather things. And if I sense people pleasing going on, I will find various ways um, to have clients trust that they're not being judged. But it really, I say all of that, and it really comes down to your way of being in the room. And if you're comfortable with you, so I think this is why the psychoanalysis, they want you to do 2 years of it. If you're comfortable with you, if you're comfortable with your imperfections, if you come to terms with, the messiness of being human, being human is messy. And I made peace with it using mindfulness. I've meditated for decades and watched my mind in action. It's very humbling to watch your mind in action. But there becomes this ease in terms of being okay with the messiness of life. And you ooze that through your presence, how you interact, your nonverbals, your verbals, there's this ease with which you are at peace with the messiness of being human. Clients feel that. And it was funny, I just did a presentation a couple hours ago, and one of the quotes I had was from a client who said, was teaching about collaborative connecting, collaborative therapy, how to relate in a way that really creates a lot of emotional safety, secure holding environment, to use psychodynamic language. And the client just said, what's different from you and other therapists I've worked with is I didn't have to defend myself against your questions. It didn't feel like I needed to defend. There was just no sense of being judged. And so when clients feel that at peace with us, and they can feel that, it's who you are. And a lot of it comes down to the self of the therapist work that you've done. And that kind of oozes off of you. They feel it in the room. It's very much through your nonverbals, and just the way you move through the world. And I think humor helps too. Okay. Fred was saying he read something about the therapist is the guardian of the client's autonomy. Yeah, we really are. It's a great quote. Oh, the decision doors, you can just sign up for one. You just need to sign up for one, or you can sign up for more than one, but yeah, one is all you need. Very cool. Okay. Hopefully, this was a nice introduction to psychodynamic, definitely one of the more intimidating of all the psychotherapy approaches. And you can check out my YouTube channel for all of a whole suite for both traditional counseling, family therapy theories, evidence-based treatments. And I look forward to seeing you. Oh, I got one more. I'm getting So let's see. If we're instructors, can we get in if cleared? Oh, about the videos? Okay, so Fernando is an instructor about the videos. So yes, all professors, and you can let those of you who are students, you can let your professors know. If you are a professor at a university, you can log into the Cengage website. You have to get permission to, as an instructor, to log into cengage.com, and that is the publisher's website. And you just add the textbook to your library and all of the ebooks, which the professors get for free. The teacher editions, you can find the videos there. And if you have trouble finding them, just email me and I will work with Cengage to make sure you get all the permissions to access those videos. Students have to pay, professors do not. Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it. I'm wishing you all a beautiful day. And I will see you next month. We're doing Adlerian therapy, definitely one of my favorites. Okay, everyone, be well and take care. Bye bye.